This is infrared sensor footage, uploaded to a classified network in June of 2024 under the uploader title UAP USO Formation CALLSIGN mission, showing 4 persistent areas of contrast moving across the lower third of the frame. Early in the clip, those 4 contrast areas transit from left to right. The image then cuts and refocuses on the same group, with sensor display elements appearing at the edges of the view. 4 long stretches the picture is processed and altered, with changes in contrast, filter strength, and zoom level that make the features shift in apparent size and brightness. At times, the sensor overlay briefly enters and leaves the frame, then the view returns to the clustered contrast regions. Midway through the footage, the camera appears to tighten its field of view, and the sensor zooms in on the 4 areas, bringing them closer and at higher apparent resolution. The objects remain distinct for several seconds. Then the quality of the recording degrades, and the contrast between those areas and the background softens. Near the end, the image fuzzes, and the contrast becomes increasingly indistinct, and the clip then appears to jump or cut back to an earlier point where the 4 areas are more visible again. The original file was presented as received, and the uploader defined the title. The media was digitally altered prior to that upload, and the clip is shown here without further manipulation. In March of 2026, 8 members of the United States House of Representatives formally requested access to a group of potentially UAP-related records that members suspected were held by the Department of War and parts of the intelligence community. The All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office identified a collection of materials on a classified network that matched those requests. ARRO assessed that this video is likely derived from an infrared sensor aboard a United States military platform. ARRO also noted that many items in the responsive collection lack a substantiated chain of custody, a factor that limits what can be concluded from the imagery alone. The video itself bears signs of prior digital processing, including contrast filters and edits that alter how objects and sensor metadata appear. That processing complicates basic questions about scale, motion, and the platform perspective, because changes in zoom and contrast can make a steady object appear to accelerate or blur. What is visible throughout the clip are 4 relatively compact regions of higher contrast against a darker background, and those regions track together for the duration of the clearer segments. The sensor display intermittently frames the view, suggesting the recording came from a mounted electro-optical infrared system. But the overlays are incomplete and at times are cropped or off-screen. There are no reliable audio cues tied to the imagery, and no accompanying telemetry in the material provided that would let analysts correlate the pixels to altitude, speed, or range. Because of the absence of that metadata, and because of the documented alterations, ARRO treats the clip as evidence that requires corroboration from other sources rather than as a standalone verification. There are a few straightforward interpretive possibilities consistent with the footage as it stands. One is that the contrast areas are real targets seen against a cooler background, detected by an infrared sensor on a military platform. Another is that processing choices and multiple edits introduced artifacts or exaggerated relative contrast between parts of the frame. A third is that a combination of sensor motion and zooming could make distant features appear to move together more tightly than they truly do. The archive notes make none of these a definitive finding. Instead, the record emphasizes uncertainty, the lack of traceable custody, and the fact that the file was altered before it entered the classified network. For viewers watching the clip, that means the imagery is suggestive but not conclusive. The context is important. This item is part of a portfolio that drew attention when members of Congress sought access, and ARRO flagged the group for further review. The release program for this material is listed as Pursue, and the Department of War published the item to a public repository on May 22, 2026. That public posting includes the caveat that the media is presented as received and that the description is informational rather than an analytical judgment about what the recording shows. Taken together, those facts make this an example of why chain of custody and source metadata matter in assessing sensor imagery. Footage that has been cropped, filtered, or otherwise digitally altered cannot by itself establish a complete account of what a sensor recorded, and that is why analysts often seek raw streams telemetry and corroborating sensor tracks before drawing firm conclusions. In this particular case, ARRO identified the clip as likely infrared imagery from a United States military platform, but also noted the material's limitations and the need for supporting records. The sequence of cuts, repeated zooms, and contrast adjustments are the principal characteristics to note while watching. For compact contrast regions that move together, a camera or sensor that sometimes zooms and sometimes pans, intermittent overlays from the sensor display, and progressive degradation in image clarity toward the end of the recording. There are no visible indications in the recording itself of a launch or breakup event. The clip does not show any obvious separation in multiple bodies or a sudden change that would indicate propulsion. The most defensible statements are about what the recording presents visually and about the provenance issues noted by the custodial agency. This material matters because it is part of a set of records that lawmakers requested, and because the custodial review found chain of custody problems and prior alteration, factors that constrain what investigators can responsibly claim from the pixels alone. It is also an illustration of the practical limits of declassified clips. They can show intriguing signatures, but without raw sensor data and authenticated handling, they leave open multiple interpretations. For analysis beyond what is visible here, researchers look for correlated radar tracks, witness reports, platform logs, and original unaltered sensor streams, none of which are included in this clip. The Department of War posting lists the original uploader, defined title, the release program, and the date the public file was made available, so that interested parties can locate the item in the public repository and consider the accompanying release notes. What you are hearing now is a description grounded in the public release and in the custodial comments about provenance and processing, not a declaration that the imagery proves a particular explanation. Find the case file, related footage, sighting reports, and our weekly UAP News podcast at UAPDrop.com.